days of these technologies, and no one knows exactly what the future holds. But the opportunity to do well by doing good has never been greater. Now let's examine the battle that's playing out today between central banks like the U.S. Federal Reserve and Bitcoin, and why the stakes are much higher than most of us realize. Where did you first come across Bitcoin?
In Chicago, when I was in college. I was studying economics and was interning at a managed futures fund. I forget exactly how I found it. I think it was actually something as stupid as Googling like obscure monetary policy as I was studying economics, and stumbled upon Bitcoin. I think around that time too, like 2012, 2013. People were talking about the Silk Road a lot as that started to blow up, and I sort of fell down the rabbit hole there and just immediately caught my attention as I was studying economics, working at this fund where we traded currency markets, and so the idea of a currency native to the internet really caught my attention, especially as somebody who was a senior in high school in the fall of 2008 when the world was falling to shit in the financial sector. And I went to college to study economics with like a know your enemy mentality. So I think I went with an open mind to be receptive to solutions that were outside the traditional financial system.
So did you immediately jump in, or?
Yeah, like I didn't buy my first Bitcoin immediately, but I definitely jumped in to the research end of things to understand how it worked, and try to consume as much content as I could around it, which was pretty sparse back in those days. And yeah, I just kept following it. When I was working at this fund, I was following, it was when Janet Yellen was the Fed chairwoman, and I think what really made me take a deeper look was one Fed meeting. There were like a bunch of traders were talking about how they were trading currency markets, and it wasn't because of the policy decisions that were made at the meeting. It was the color of Janet Yellen's jacket. I believe it was like purple. And they said the fact that she's wearing a purple dress or jacket at this meeting exudes power, so we're gonna trade markets this way. She's trying to send a message. And I was like, this probably isn't how currency markets should operate.
Right. Yeah. But you had to have learned a lot while you were there. Does any of that kind of carry over to Bitcoin?
Yeah. I mean, I learned a lot in the sense that, like, when you're trading currency markets, I was an analyst, so I was tasked with writing commentaries on why the markets moved the way they did and why our fund performed in parallel to those market movements. And so I had to understand the policy decisions and the mechanics of monetary policy globally, not only the Federal Reserve, the ECB, Bank of Japan, PBOC, whatever it may be. And so I learned how these entities were managing these currencies that everybody used, and that juxtaposed to Bitcoin, which has no central authority or entity that's able to manipulate the way this monetary system works. It really started to gain my attention and my respect, and I think I just came to the conclusion it's the way a monetary system should probably work compared to the fiat monetary system, which is able to be manipulated pretty easily by a very select few people, and that manipulation has ripple effects throughout the world that I would argue are immoral and affect the poor the most.
Absolutely, I 100% agree. So Bitcoin was a solution that was moral.
Yeah, and around the same time was when WikiLeaks was blowing up as well with their email drops, and Edward Snowden was big in the news. And again, I went to college with this mentality, know your enemy. It feels like the system's just rigged against the small guy. And so WikiLeaks particularly was a big part of Bitcoin's early story, where they were essentially forced to accept Bitcoin for donations because all the major payment processors and bank providers cut them off from their ability to access money. And so Bitcoin being there as a solution for WikiLeaks specifically was really probably a powerful moment in my journey now that I think back. Like, I was like, all right, this thing works. Like, people are sending money to WikiLeaks. There's nothing the CIA, the FBI, or the governments around the world can do about it. And they really want to prevent this entity from receiving money, but they can't stop Bitcoiners from sending them Bitcoin, and then them sending Bitcoin after they've received it. That moment particularly is very powerful in proving that Bitcoin does what it says it does. Because, right, you have the asset, which is scarce. It's implementing a sound monetary policy in the digital age, but then you have the network, which is distributed and enables you to make the transactions that the authorities don't want you to make.
Yeah, what was it about Bitcoin that really made it stand apart in a category of its own to you?
Well, yeah, I think Satoshi, the way he launched it and the way it came to be, is very pure. Right, these things are going to succeed. Arguably, they already are, threatening governments and central authorities' control, not only over the monetary system. Once you lose control, central control over a monetary system, that you lose control over things that are downstream.
I get the sense that you see Bitcoin as something bigger than, just money. Like, what kind of impact do you think Bitcoin is going to have on society?
Bitcoin is the greatest extension of natural rights since the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, whatever you want to pinpoint as the extension of natural rights that were afforded to us when the Founding Fathers created America. Bitcoin protects private property in the digital age better than anything that's ever existed on this planet, whether it be digital or meat space related. And so for me, Bitcoin I got into it for the money, like literally for the sound money, and because I think it's wiser to run society on a sound monetary policy. But now I'm in it for freedom.
You're a professor, and you teach blockchain and cryptocurrencies. How did you get into that?
Well, I've been at DePaul University for about 8 years, and prior to that, I was an economist with the Federal Reserve. So my background is in money and banking, and so it was actually money and banking courses that got me started. I teach about the history of money and also the future of money, and my students were the ones who started asking me about Bitcoin and when are we going to talk about Bitcoin? And so I now incorporate that into all of my courses, and then the graduate course on blockchain and crypto, I started 3 years ago to focus specifically on this topic.
What transitioned us from, a Federal Reserve-backed currency or created currency to cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, so I tell people, I think this is a natural evolution of money. A lot of people think this is very new and sometimes strange. It's like funny money or it's not real. But, this is, I think, a progression that we've been seeing for decades now. So if you go back to like 1971, that was when the U.S. dollar went off the gold standard under Richard Nixon, and we just marked the 50-year anniversary of that. So the U.S. dollar is what's called a fiat currency. It is not pegged to any physical commodity. It only has value because it's backed by the faith and credit of the U.S. government. And we have become very comfortable with physical bills, like a $20 bill that we can put in our pocket, but most people don't pay with cash anymore. We've been moving towards this thing called the cashless society for a number of years now. Other countries are even further along in that direction. My students, most of them don't even own a wallet. They just, they pay for stuff using their phone. And so, we've seen this progression from physical cash to electronic payments. And I think now with crypto, what we're seeing is electronic cash. So that's really, it's physical cash, electronic payments, electronic cash. So it functions like cash, but it only exists on the internet as a means of virtual payment. And so we're moving towards this form of digital money. And I think as we move towards a digital economy, it only makes sense that we would see that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of people, kind of a question about what gives, say, Bitcoin value.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of people who would say it has no value, and that if you buy it, you're a fool because it's, it's a Ponzi scheme. Warren Buffett has come out and said very critical things about it, which is understandable. Bitcoin doesn't produce anything. There's no cash flow, not like a stock or a bond, and so I think there are some people who really question crypto assets as an investment because they don't produce anything, but they are more like a commodity. So under regulatory frameworks, Bitcoin has been labeled as a commodity, not a security, but it is still an investable asset, and I think the value really comes from its role as money. So again, people tend to think the US dollar has value, but it's not backed by anything. And if you look at gold has no intrinsic value. It's not very good at conducting electricity. It's very malleable, so it's not very strong. And so it really only has value because people attribute value to it, and because it is scarce and has become a store of value. So I think Bitcoin in particular is transitioning into more of a digital gold, something that doesn't have any intrinsic value, but people can use it as a store of value, and the value really comes from the network. I think to understand the crypto market, you have to understand what are called network effects. The more people who use it and adopt it, the more it can function as a transfer of value, where I can buy and sell with it. I can provide money to other people using this. And so as that network grows, the value will increase. So again, part of what I love about this, and I think why you're interested in this and so many people are interested in this, is cryptocurrency is money without banks and without governments. And some people like governments owning and controlling money because it gives them comfort that someone is there watching and the buck stops here, so to speak. But there's a huge history of governments mismanaging money for the wrong reasons. Some developing economies were printing money, producing hyperinflation. Zimbabwe, it gets out of control. Then people say, well, the U.S. is different. We never have any of those problems. But if you look back over those 50 years, when we went off the gold standard, 1970s, huge inflation, double digit here in the U.S. Most of us now have forgotten that ever happened. And it was really Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve, who raised interest rates and got that under control. And so, since the Greenspan days, we've had inflation targeting. The Fed has managed to keep inflation roughly around 2% or just below. But, two episodes, I think, have started to raise questions about that. One was the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009, quantitative easing, QE1, QE2, QE3, massive increases in the money supply. And there were some people who said, well, this is going to lead to crazy inflation because, the Fed's just printing too much money. And we didn't see that. Yeah. So, if you look back over that period following the crisis, inflation remained quite low. But that was really a global phenomenon. The entire kind of international financial system was struggling with low price growth. But during COVID, we've seen with all this monetary stimulus, it's increasing even more. Inflation is starting to tick up. And so I think there's a lot of questions about, is this sustainable? And to me, that brings to the point of do you want someone managing the money supply? Our current system with central banks is they have full discretion over whether to increase or reduce the money supply. Some people like that because then they can manage the economy. They can provide more or less as it warrants. But what I love about crypto is it's entirely transparent. It's all in the code, in the protocol. And so the supply of Bitcoin is increasing at this very steady rate. And there's no kind of wizard behind the curtain that's kind of controlling that. And so supply, you know what you're going to get. And so the price fluctuations are all about demand, which I think is kind of how it should be. Many people in the kind of the financial markets today would say that central banks have become too active, that the Fed is intervening too often. And so, the US stock market, S&P 500, a lot of that's driven by the Fed. And so it's not about corporate earnings or profitability. The whole market rises and falls based on monetary policy. And so if we can shift towards a monetary policy that's more kind of basic, transparent, and less interventionist, then like you said, we could arguably move back towards a more free market economy.